Why are summers at the Shalom Hartman Institute so special?
Because that's when Jewish leaders and learners like you and me travel to Jerusalem to wrestle with big ideas and study with Hartman's inspiring faculty.
The Shalom Hartman Institute is a pluralistic think tank and educational center for the Jewish people.
Our scholars draw on 3,000 years of Jewish wisdom to develop the ideas we need to face today's challenges.
This summer, the pandemic has prevented us from traveling, but it doesn't prevent us from learning together. Welcome.
Join hundreds of Jewish leaders for All Together Now, a month-long celebration of ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute. From now until July the 23rd, come learn with us in this moment of crisis and opportunity.
Hello, everyone. I wish I could see you in person, but it's nice to know that you're there. I'm greeting Claire Sufrin. Hello, Claire. This is like a romper room. I see you, Claire. And there's Yehuda Kertzer. Hello, Yehuda. Nice to see you. And a shout out to Sam Hainbach, because he is the mastermind behind the technology and preparation. Hello, Sam. I am really thrilled and privileged to have been asked to help be part of this launch for, I think, what is an extraordinary and important book. I am welcoming you to the Robert P. Kogod Annual Lecture, and this series is part of All Together Now. I hope some of you have already been part of this because it's, I think, a week in the running. Jewish Ideas for This Moment is the subtitle, and it's Shalom Hartman Institute's free month-long celebration of Jewish ideas. Tonight's discussion is obviously about the launch of Yehuda Kertzer and Claire Sufrin's book that they've edited called The New Jewish Canon, and it's co-sponsored by one of my second homes, the Marlene Meyerson JCC in Manhattan. I miss all of you back in New York and being together on Amsterdam Avenue, so a shout out to them. This session is going to be recorded, which doesn't mean you can get off now and have a snack. You have to stay with us, but for those you want to recommend it to, we're going to send you a link. It'll be available to watch in, I think, 48 hours. And you should absolutely send questions in real time as they occur to you. Put them in the chat box. I think we're all pretty Zoom versed at this point. And Sam is going to kind of cull them and organize them for me so I can, when we turn to questions in the last segment, go to your inquiries. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists and co-editors. Dr. Yehuda Kertzer is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He's a leading thinker and author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews, on Jewish history and Jewish memory, and on questions of leadership and change in American Jewish life. He is also the author of Shuva, The Future of the Jewish Past. It's not in your bio here, Yehuda, but you're very cute kids. And if you're not following him on Facebook, you can see how good a cook he is, especially during this pandemic. It's one of the silver linings of a very challenging time. And just full disclosure, I have been lucky enough to study with Yehuda in small groups for many years and very different opportunities. And I would say he has absolutely changed my Judaism. So I want to give him a real nod for the effect he's had. And Claire Sufrin is also Dr. Claire Sufrin. She is a scholar of religion specializing in modern Jewish thought and theology. She is Associate Professor of Instruction and Assistant Director of Jewish Studies in the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern University. Full disclosure again, my son went to Northwestern. He unfortunately didn't study with Claire, but I know by reputation she was one of the favorites on campus. And her husband is a star to my son because he is the director of the Hillel on campus and literally kept my son a Jew while in college. And Claire also has really very adorable children. So now let's jump into the meat of this. Do you guys want to say anything since I've been talking?
No, you're great.
Okay, good. I'm not even, it's nice to sort of silence Yehuda for a change. I want to start with the concept of this book. It's obviously a huge undertaking. And before we get to the title, which has already created its own, I think, chapter for the next Jewish Canon, of why call it a canon, or are you entitled to call it a canon? Let's just talk about the vision for what was the intention in doing this, and how did you all, what was the gestation? How did it come to be?
Great. So, actually, there was first of all, Abby, thank you for doing this. I can't imagine anybody else with whom I would like to be in conversation for the launch of this book than you. You're a master at this, and so it's a delight to be in conversation with you now. And as you gave some disclosures, one of the things that I studied with Abby's study group last year was actually pieces of the New Jewish Canon. So they were some of the first readers of this material. So I'll share my kind of where I came at it from this book. Claire joined the project shortly after it got started, first as a contributor, and you can share your own narrative of where you come at this, Claire. But, first of all, I found myself teaching a lot of contemporary stuff. A lot of the essays in the book were things that already had started a kind of conversation in the Jewish community about the production of Jewish thought. And I found myself teaching a lot of these materials and saying to myself, I wish I had a textbook that would enable me to teach what's going on for the Jewish people between 1980 to 2015. So that's one of the pieces of this. But I guess the other is, Claire and I hosted a gathering a couple of years, maybe 6-7 years ago at Hartman on what we called post-Holocaust Jewish thought. And Claire was one of the scholars who we invited to come. And part of the reason for doing that gathering was that my co-organizer, Rabbi Josh Fagelson, and I both had this kind of realization that if you Googled the term post-Holocaust Jewish thought, most of what you're going to find ends in the 1970s, as though the production of post-Holocaust thought really ends in the 1970s. But part of what happens is that we tend to be resistant. I think it's a general statement. We tend to be resistant of the recent stuff as being serious enough. And we're kind of like waiting till 30 years from now for somebody to look back and say what was important. And in fact, we were noticing that there's this incredible world of Jewish ideas, debates, and conversations, the production of texts. And I wanted to really elevate all of those. So there was a desire for this to be a kind of textbook of the moment, but also a kind of cultural statement about what's new in Jewish life.
And for those who haven't seen it, let's kind of take 2 steps back and talk about how it's constructed before I go to Claire. Can you just summarize how it's built in the sense that there's essentially an essay or a debate and then a commentary and the voices that are coming through it?
So we curated 70 primary source excerpts of prose nonfiction from 1980 to 2015. We divided them into 4 imperfect categories. We can talk about that more later. Jewish politics in the public square, religion and religiosity, history and memory, identities and communities. And then for each of those, we invited scholars, some senior scholars in the field, some junior scholars in the field, some graduate students, to weigh in on the significance of those pieces and to really try to tell an accessible story of why did this document or why did this piece of literature matter. So it has primary sources, but it also has these secondary sources as well.
And Claire, Yehuda mentioned that you would like it to be a textbook, or that he was missing that textbook, but that's kind of a deadly word for the publishing industry. That's not going to be a book that catches fire. And I think, obviously, even though I think this will be used far and wide as a textbook, I think you also, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would say this is also a bedside reading book that is engaging, challenging, and frankly, completely speaks to so many of the debates that we're having actually right at this moment. So can you just talk about how you want the book or envision the book to be used?
Sure. I love the image of it as a bedside book because that is actually how I think of it. And at the risk of confessing too much, I'm a kid who grew up reading the encyclopedia when I was bored. But the similarity that I see, and I see this as a positive, is that you can open the book anywhere. Wherever you open it, each little text and commentary is at most 5 pages long. So you can open to a page, flip until something catches your eye, and have 10, 15 minutes of reading and put it aside, pick it up the next day, open to an entirely different place, and do the same thing over and over until you've read the whole book. Or you could read it cover to cover. Maybe not in one day. I'm not sure I'd recommend that, but
I just have to interrupt for 1 minute.
Way of engaging with it. Yeah.
I just have to interrupt for 1 minute because that was my experience when I was preparing for this. I wanted to read it all, but obviously it is quite a tome. But I wanted to basically also kind of flit around a little bit. And it was that experience of, oh, if wherever you opened it, you were instantly in of an argument, a debate, a story. I know it's not a compliment probably to hear that it's a good bathroom book, and I'm not speaking personally there, but when I wrote my first book, Stars of David, that was the highest compliment, is that, you know, I'd interviewed prominent Jews, celebrities and public figures, and that you could basically pick it up and put it down, which I think is an important thing for people, readers, prospective readers, to know who might feel overwhelmed. It's an overwhelming table of contents. So I want to give you a chance to talk about not just its accessibility, because it's very dense. We can't argue that it is, you know, this is a deep dive, but that there are worlds that you can step in and out of. And please go on, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say one of the things that is really special about this book is that the people who commented on all of the primary sources, these are not the kind of essays that get you tenure. These are not, we didn't pay anybody to write their commentary. People wrote their commentaries because these are materials they're passionate about. And that comes through in the text, that our commentators really care about what they're writing about, and they think that the reader should care as well. And so, you know, wherever, again, you pick up and you read, even if you start with something you already know, within a couple of pages, you'll be thinking about things very passionately that you didn't know anything about before.
And Yehuda, one of the things that struck me reading it is that you're going places that many Jews actually aren't comfortable going. And that is that we have our narratives about Israel, about identity, about memory, about the Holocaust. And what a lot of these essays do, I think, is shake the foundation a little bit, maybe with which we were raised, or with which our synagogue or our institution, our favorite institutions approach them. Can you just address a little bit whether that was intentionally agitational, or whether you're basically saying, look, these are the debates, these are the things that riled our community up in ways that were positive and very difficult, but we need to know about them and engage them honestly.
Yeah, I don't think the project here was intentionally agitational. I would say it a little bit differently. You know, it's just always a weird paradox around the things that we talk about as the third rail conversations in Jewish life, the dangerous conversations, what we can't talk about, because the weird paradox is those are the only things that people want to talk about. They're the issues where there's tremendous passion. What I think we mean by that is that they are the kinds of conversations where we're never really sure whether we're going to get in trouble for saying the things that we want to say, where there are, I would say, oftentimes implicit boundaries or tripwires in those conversations, and where there is a culture of those who are policing the conversation and making sure that what is said is appropriate. And you know, again, part of the paradox is these are the most important conversations that many of us feel implicated by and want to be talking about. So the goal was not agitation as much as it was a mirror to our community. I think actually I think that's for better or worse. We miss things in the book, I'm sure. But what I do hope is that a contemporary Jew or a reader or someone who's interested in Jewish life looks at this book, and if they don't like it, well, that's kind of on us. Right? Those are the conversations that have been these are the conversations that have been agitating our community for some time. And I would say, from an activist standpoint, I think this is part of the work of the Institute. We have to figure out a way as a community to have the best possible version of a conversation about the issues with the highest stakes. It's, as opposed to simply allowing for the implicit policing that's taking place around these conversations to turn those conversations into being less interesting. You know, it means, like, there are pieces in the book that are yucky, right? Like but those are part of the data of the contemporary Jewish experience, is that we don't get to choose all of the primary texts of our own lived experience, but we are responsible to be more authentic interpreters of those stories. And then if we want to write a better version of that, at least we have the raw materials to do that.
And Claire, I want you to answer, but I wonder if we're going to get to the essays themselves, but did you feel the same way that this has to be a truthful reflection, whether we personally are comfortable with some of the opinions in it or not?
You know, I'm enough of a postmodern academic, I always get itchy around the word truth. So I'm going to bracket the word truth and say, you know, I want to say that the flip side to what Yehuda was saying about sort of the third rail being all we actually want to talk about, there are plenty of people who feel like they don't know enough to engage in the conversation, or who prefer to just pretend the conversation isn't happening. And so when I'm thinking, for example, we include some of the material from Breaking the Silence, which is a group in Israel deeply critical of the occupation. And I'm remembering I brought that material to an adult education setting a few months ago. And I remember, there were people in the group who literally didn't want to look at the page. As though to say, if I don't look at the page, then I don't have to deal with this material, with the challenge, with the fact that, I don't know, maybe their kids are engaged in this kind of criticism of Israel. And I think that to go in that direction, to leave out material, whether it's on the right or the left or anywhere in between, that some people, maybe even we, would prefer to bury, isn't honest or isn't responsible to the moment. And also, at the end of the day, this book is also going to be an artifact of our moment. And that's another reason that we should be fair, or try to be fair to our moment.
Just for those who don't know, Breaking the Silence, and you all correct me, is former IDF soldiers who have give testimony about some of what they did and saw that was very uncomfortable in terms of handling of Palestinian population that they were when they were in the territories. Yehuda, before we go to the examples, which I know everyone is wanting us to do, I just want to talk about the word canon, because obviously it's chutzpahdik, and you've been certainly gotten some pushback on that. I know you well enough, both you and Claire, to know that you don't do things by accident. Did you wrestle with it? Partly, I think part of the pushback is that it has religious connotations, first of all, and it also has the sense that the two of you are sort of anointing certain voices and others are being left out. And knowing Jews as I do, as much as I love them, I can't imagine and I know actually from having our conversation before we go on, that there were people who would say, why am I not in this book? Or why is so-and-so not in this book? And I think it was very wise of Yehuda when I was studying with him. I didn't even know that my mother was included in this book. I was surprised to look at the table of contents and see her there. That's how discreet he was. I know that has nothing to do with our relationship. I personally think she deserves to be there, although she's a lightning rod too in her own wonderful way, only at the dinner table. But just in terms of that word canon, why did you choose it, and why is it accurate here, and I think important here?
Yeah, I'm aware. I was aware when we came up with the title of this book that we were poking, and that there was something a little bit cheeky about the use of this terminology, that we were granting ourselves a certain stature to be able to not just be doing the lighter work of like an anthology that just says, okay, I collected a bunch of things and put them together, even though an anthology also privileges the anthologizers to be making choices of what's in and what's out, but Canon kind of took it to the next level. So I knew that we were poking a little bit. And at the same time, I think we had two intentions with the word canon that are easily misunderstood or misappropriated. One is there are open canons and there are closed canons. Just because you've decided that this is the foundation of a body of literature or a key set of ideas doesn't mean that we are deciding indefinitely and in perpetuity that there aren't other pieces that should have been included. But there are, because there are historically open canons and closed canons, and we were definitely thinking in terms of the first. The other is that canon can sometimes refer to making things holy, and sometimes it doesn't. And I know that our critics really picked up on the sense that by putting some of the authors that we put into this book, including a whole bunch of people who have committed bad acts, a handful of individuals over the last few, since Me Too, who were exposed as having committed sexual assault, sexual harassment, that by including them in the book, we were making a value judgment about their holiness, their validity, that we were trying to rehabilitate their reputation. That wasn't our intention. Our intention was to acknowledge a significant body of ideas and actually a significant site of power in the Jewish community, and one that we have to wrestle with. But what it ultimately is about, Abby, and I think I heard this among our critics in a way that I hadn't fully understood before. This whole exercise is a question of power, right? So the decision to include this or not include that is powerful in and of itself, right? It signals something in, someone out, and it goes to whether we think that we have implicit power or whether we're actually assuming power in a moment like this. I think both Claire and I, one thing that I learned from Claire was a comment that you made in the process of responding to the criticism that we had received, which was, this was a far more personal project for the both of us than I think either of us had given credit for, in that we grew up with these. These are the authors, writers, thinkers, and ideas that shaped our own upbringings. Both of us were born in the late 70s, so it really runs our lifetime. So I don't know that we thought of ourselves as having the same power to be deciding who's in and who's out, as much as provoking a conversation about who's in and who's out. But I'm sure that some of the criticism that came our way assumed that we were sitting from a place of power, or that we were imputing that power to ourselves, and in doing so, granting privileged status to a whole bunch of ideas and individuals that other people found to be problematic, that we find to be problematic. So I think that's what we're playing with here.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything, or you feel like?
Well, you brought up your mother's book, Deborah Golda and Me, and I can, building on that sense that this book is a reflection of the texts that shaped us. I remember when my mom brought your mother's book and brought it into our house. I remember where it sat. I remember asking her permission to read it and everything that it evoked for me. And that's why it's in the canon. It's an example of several texts that are in there that I have to do with Jewish feminism, because feminism ultimately has reshaped Judaism as it's practiced today, maybe more than any other movement. And, that's one thing that the book tries to capture with a number of texts, even though there are many, many others. We should probably say your mom's name.
Sorry,
Letty Cotton Pogrebin.
Thank you. And I will just say about that, and this is where, in a way, because I'm older than you all, that when I have traveled myself to Jewish communities, and there are so many women of my mother's generation saying that, that book changed my life, that book changed my life, it allowed me to sort of find an egalitarian Judaism. It was actually sort of news to me. I mean, obviously, I admire and love my mother, but I realized that this was a generation that had really not been able to find their way, many of them, through a Jewish ritual that included them. There was no female Jewish leadership in that time. There were no, but I grew up with with women rabbis. I grew up with a feminist Seder. So my perspective was very much, the sort of the post Deborah Golda and me experience. And to your point, I only learned later sort of how formative a book like that could be from a particular generation. But let's dive in now. I'm going to start with you, Yehuda. And I particularly like to look at are you comfortable talking about the Amos Oz? So why don't you kind of lay out again what this essay, or this was a compilation of his articles, and then the response to it, the commentary.
Yeah, this is one of my, I probably shouldn't say this with 70 contributors, but it was one of my favorite essays in the book, was Wendy Zierler's commentary on Amos Oz's really formative book called In the Land of Israel, in Hebrew, Po V'Sham Be'eretz Yisrael. Amos Oz writes a book that in the early 80s is not as much a collection of essays as kind of almost like an Israeli de Tocqueville journey of an Israeli around his own society. One of the reasons it's a powerful statement about the front end of the book, and a good indicator of why 1980 is actually an interesting moment when we think about Israel is it's post the Likud revolution in the late 70s, post the transformation of Israeli political culture, after Entebbe, which is kind of the last great moment in Israeli history when Jews are unequivocally on top on the world stage and a source of celebration. And it's right around the time of Israel's first non-existential war, Lebanon, which Israel could lose and arguably did, and doesn't result in the dismantling of the country. And the rise as a result of a new voice in Israeli politics, which is openly and publicly critical of Israeli policy, even Israeli military policy. And so Oz in the early 80s travels around Israel and gives voice to the increasing polarization within Israeli society. He goes to Ofra in one of the famous chapters of the book and gives his own talk of why he's opposed to settlements, and then listens to the participants and gives voice to them. And what was extraordinary about the book is that it really holds up, not just because some of the same issues that Oz is identifying in that moment are still present in Israeli society. In fact, it's almost like a template for what the next 40 years of Israeli debates are going to look like. It's not just because of that, but it's kind of like a version of what it means to be intimately connected to Israel's problems that I am desperate for American Jews to continue to be involved with. There's a weird parallelism between Oz's book and Shavit's book, My Promised Land. The difference being that Oz is much more of an observer of Israeli society rather than Shavit, who puts it in his own prism. And I think what Wendy does powerfully in her essay is to actually listen to this as a story of modern Israel, right at a key moment, key inflection point of this turning point. Oz is most famous as a novelist, but he actually he emerges both in his own writing and through the parsing of it as kind of a prophet of the central challenges that are facing Israel. I
just want to read one quick excerpt that was so powerful that he wrote in one of his pieces. He says, "I accept those rules of the game," meaning the game of nations, obviously referring to Israel, "because existence without the tools of statehood is a matter of mortal danger. But I accept them only up to this point. To take pride in these tools of statehood, to worship these toys, to crow about them, not I. If we must maintain these tools, including the instruments of death, it must be not only with glee, but with wisdom as well. I would say no glee at all, only with wisdom and with caution. Nationalism itself is, in my eyes, the curse of mankind." And I just was surprised with the strength of that, because I always thought of him as kind of one of Israel's, not the most controversial of voices. Maybe I think I was misguided there.
I mean, it also tells you a little bit of the changing nature of the debate around Zionism today, which is Oz, by the end of his life, is actually a very outspoken defender of Israel's, in some ways, Israel's right to defend itself, but is capable of parsing the distinction between what it means to have a right to defend itself and be an outspoken critic of the settlement project. I mean, that's unusual. And in the contemporary conversation, even in real time over this past week, that distinction has become almost extinct. You know, there's a great interview that Oz does with a German publication in 2014 around the Gaza war, and you know that the German publication was coming to interview him because they wanted him to be publicly critical of Israel, and Oz starts the interview by saying, "May I go first?" The interviewer is taken aback, and Oz says to him, "Imagine that you have a kindergarten in your apartment, and somebody is shooting at you from the apartment across there. What do you do?" And the interviewer is silent, and he goes, "Okay, you can start the interview now." So Oz, it's very unusual, because even in that piece, he acknowledges, which is one of the primary texts in the book, he acknowledges that there is a basic moral decency and legitimacy of survival. We should not romanticize the alternatives, but we better not let nationalism become the religion of itself.
So Claire, I want to turn to one of the pieces that you were the what do you call, the commentator on, and that is Elie Wiesel's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, December 10th, 1986. This actually, I'm sure this will make other readers do this. It made me go to the YouTube to watch it, because you refer to how he gave this wonderful detail about, was it you or was it, yes, that it
with the kippah.
He put on a kippah in order to say the Shechianu for the moment before giving the speech, and then took it off to give the speech. And I want you to talk about why that's both the particularistic and the universal, but just the fact that I wanted to go see him do it and see how overwhelmed he was with emotion at that moment. I think to be standing there receiving this Nobel Prize, knowing what he had survived and endured. So just talk about, like, why is this a choice as one of the pieces?
Sure. So that's really the piece that baited me and got me involved in the whole project. Yehuda reached out to me first to write about this speech, and the conversation took off from there until I found myself co-editing. I had never read, actually, the Nobel, the speech that Wiesel gave when he got the Peace Prize. I had never read it before, even though I have read, he wrote so much in his life. I won't say that I've read all of it, maybe half of it. And even doing some research on him. To me, he's a fascinating figure. He used to visit my family's synagogue every year, and he would do a couple of different things. He would It was a major fundraiser, so they'd have a big Friday night dinner. And the appeal of the Friday night dinner was that at the end, Wiesel would sit with everyone who wanted to linger and sing Zmirot. So you could come have dinner and sing Zmirot with Elie Wiesel. And it was a huge highlight. And then he would give 2 talks over the weekend. And one,
translate that for just to make sure in
yes,
case.
thank you. So Zmirot, I mean, it's literally songs, but they're Sabbath songs, the kind of songs you sing when you don't really want to leave the table because you don't have to get up and go to work the next day. Some of them based in the liturgy, some of them very poetic. The kinds of songs that different people from different places would have different tunes for. And so Wiesel would bring the tunes of his youth. He would then give 2 talks over the weekend. And one talk he would teach Talmud, and in the other talk he would speak to the affairs of the day. And this, to me, this event, especially as I grew older and became more reflective, what did it say about him that people wanted to come and hear him teach Talmud as sort of a relic of this old Jewish world that was lost, but also that he was a commentator on Jewish issues, Jewish ideas, Jewish questions of the moment. And the Peace Prize, that speech, it doesn't resolve or it doesn't answer that question for me, but it gives us a moment where he recognizes sort of the complexity of who he had become already. The Peace Prize, he gets it for everything that he's done to raise awareness about the Holocaust, to fight other injustices. And yet, and this is something that I think is really, something that we continue to think about even after his death. He was devoted to the Jews, to the Jewish people, first and foremost. And when he accepts the prize, he accepts it as a representative of all survivors, and then sort of states basically that survivors they're not the remnant of a lost world, they're the representatives of all the Jewish people. And yet, right, the Nobel Peace Prize is not a Jewish prize. It's a prize for some kind of vision of a world peace. And his speech then moves in that direction. And so I tried in my comments to kind of unpack all of that. And then I watched the video. And it's amazing. I think we just have to say how amazing it is in this day and age that we can watch a video that wasn't accessible to people when it happened in 1986. And I see that the text of the speech does not record that he begins with the Hebrew blessing of the Shechianu, thanking God for having brought him to that moment. And it's such, it's not just it's a Jewish moment. To me, that blessing is a statement of great humility, right? Mm. Who am I, right? Why am I here? And to me, that balances out the sort of the man recognizing the greatness that he's achieved, sort of this moment of like, why me? Why am I here?
Very
and I tried to capture all that in my commentary.
Beautifully. And I just want to read one bit from the speech, which is it is again worth reading and seeing. I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. Kind of amazing. I just remember when I went to the Anne Frank Museum that they described, maybe it wasn't the actual, the docent of the museum, but whoever was with us with Central Synagogue was explaining the controversy about whether Anne Frank should be a figure against all hate everywhere or anti-Semitism specifically. And it's something that I had never even known was complicated. And so to read this piece that really resonated the same way, Elie Wiesel did call out apartheid, and he called out basically injustice wherever it lands, but some people were waiting for him to talk about Palestinians before he died in a way that he never had. And even thinking there could be anything that was controversial about Elie Wiesel, I think it's important to revisit these words. I need to move on because of time.
Yeah.
Yehuda, I want to go to the piece that you write about, one of the pieces you write about, which is Stephen Cohen and Jack Wertheimer, right? Is that the pronunciation? I know Stephen, but not Jack. Whatever happened to the Jewish people they co-wrote this piece in commentary in 2006. If you could set it up for us and talk about your response to it.
Yeah, so Stephen M. Cohen is one of the more controversial figures who we included in the book. As folks know, he was probably the most preeminent American Jewish sociologist throughout this period, 1980 to 2015, winds up controlling quite a bit of the kind of Jewish, what I would call like the inside Jewish knowledge economy. Sociological studies for Jewish communities, sits in a position that juxtaposes between knowledge and communal decision-making. So it's not merely studying who American Jews are, it's actually having a huge influence on the kind of culture of philanthropy of where American Jews ostensibly should be going. And then in, I think it was 2018, steps down from a variety of positions because a number of women stepped forward accusing him, and then he acknowledged of behavior ranging from sexual harassment to sexual assault over the course of his career, and has basically disappeared from the map today. So he's one of the kind of triggering examples of this book, especially in the presence of a field where he did leave an outsized imprint over a long period of time. It was very clear to me, to us, that you can't really understand the knowledge economy of American Jewish life throughout this period without understanding the Voice of Cohen. One of the kind of interesting pieces of his work is that he also collaborates throughout his career with many different scholars, including both senior scholars and junior scholars. And one of his frequent collaboration partners is Jack Wertheimer, a professor at Jewish Theological Seminary. And in 1996, Cohen and Wertheimer team up in response to the 1990 Jewish population study by effectively indicting the American Jewish community for not pushing back against the dominant sociological trends that had governed the American Jewish community. And by 2006, they have become basically unbelievably impatient, not just about what was the first issue that they were pushing against, which was intermarriage, believing that American Jews should not subordinate themselves to intermarriage, shouldn't give in. But by 2006, their critique has expanded to argue, as they do. It's one of the most haunting lines in the book, is when they say an American Jewish community that won't advocate for its own interests shows no sign of self-respect. So they've expanded from not merely talking about intermarriage to indicting the American Jewish community for failing to stand up to what they would call basically Jewish peoplehood causes, advocating on behalf of particularism in the midst of a Jewish community that has, in their view, become highly universalistic. And I think there are a couple of reasons why this matters. One,
before you go on, when you say it had become universalistic, can you put that in plainer language? Like what I understand from them, and I've heard obviously Professor Cohen quite a bit, was this sense that you're sort of losing Jewish pride and Jewish differentness. Is that a fair reading? One just to again tell you kind of how I'm coming at this. When I read part of the essay itself in your section here, a people no longer proud of what and who it is, no longer dedicated to caring for its own, can not long expect to be held in high regard by others or to move the world by its message.
Can I jump in with it? With an example, to me, this is a really powerful example. In the 1980s, American Jews were marching to save Soviet Jewry. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, Jews were marching, for example, against genocide in Darfur, which is not an immediately Jewish cause, but they marched because they saw it as an expression of Jewish values on behalf of the world, or for the sake of the world.
You know, I think if I can just step back from this for a second, because I know that there are some questions emerging about the choice to use text by men who we now recognize to be abusive. Part of the whole issue here, and part of the reason of continuing to study Cohen in this context, and I do want to separate between Cohen and Wertheimer. They write the essay together, but they're not the same human being. What's so incredibly important about these essays is that the American Jewish community has been undergoing a process of differentiation between how American Jews act and how some American Jews think American Jews should act. And Cohen and Wertheimer represent kind of apex of that. So you have the trends in American Jewish life towards, at the time, one of the main organizations that they were targeting with this was American Jewish World Service, because it was bugging them that instead of American Jews focusing on Jews marrying other Jews and an internal discourse of supporting other Jews in crisis, that Jews are basically giving their money to help people elsewhere around the world, as Claire said, places like Darfur. And it's the choice to make this argument is not merely an intellectual argument. It actually winds up being connected to a tremendous amount of philanthropic power. So the single largest philanthropic effort that emerges in the Jewish community as a result of the 1990 Jewish population study are programs like Birthright Israel, which are intended to actually promote endogamy, Jews marrying Jews, and intended to promote a sense that Jews should be connected to this esoteric thing that called Jewish peoplehood that both Cohen and Wertheimer are passionate about. So I guess what I struggle with the book is I understand the criticism of, by continuing to put these authors forward, it sounds like, well, we're amplifying their views as being authoritative. What we also have to understand is that there was a reason why they were authoritative for a long period of time, having to do with their own influence, having to do with the ways in which you can juxtapose ideas to power and ideas to money. And if we're going to make sense of the period 1980 to 2015, we have to look at moments like this, where the Jewish community's values were rightly or wrongly being articulated in this way. What's a more complicated piece? There's a handful of scholars who argue that you can't disconnect between the abusive behavior of these men and their ideas, both because they managed to push other people out of the conversation, or because maybe something about the intermarriage, and this approach to intermarriage is fundamentally misogynistic. I'm not sure how I feel about that scholarship. But we at least have to wrestle with it, and we have to put it in play. And the idea that we would erase it and say, well, that's irrelevant from the period 1980 to 2015, not only does it misrepresent what happened in the American Jewish community during this time, but it will prevent us from understanding why counter views of American Jewish life, prescriptive, normative, or descriptive, failed to actually marshal as much power during this period, because this represents a kind of power center in Jewish life.
Well, I also think, because I remember hearing Stephen Cohen speak often, that he was marshaling a lot of data, and that data was driving then Jewish organizations and, frankly, development around those Jewish organizations. Basically, if you want to keep Jews, if you want to make more Jews, there has to be Jewish camp. If you want to make more Jews, there has to be less intermarriage. And I think what's important about reading this, at least for me who lived through it and has gone to all these organizations' fundraisers, is that it's very much a narrative that was glommed onto and became kind of unimpeachable. Like, look at the data, look at the numbers, as opposed to, in a sense, saying, why are we even responding to that as if it should be in some way a blueprint for how to be Jews, how to continue continuity.
Let me say one other thing on this, which is the very word data is so loaded, Abby, because what data counts? If you're going to prescribe a set of behaviors and practices for what American Jews should do, of what American Jews need and want, how you ask the questions is going to have a huge impact on how you assemble that data. It's one of the strongest critiques of the Jewish sociology industry for a long time, especially of Cohen, who many sociologists have said, you're asking questions where you're rigging what kinds of activities are defined as Jewish, and then asking people, do they do those or not do those? And I have a vested interest in this. I mean, this is my institutional interest, which is, I am really interested that the sources of data that should help shape the Jewish communal agenda are not merely sociology. I'm actually really interested in philosophy and Talmud and other sites of Jewish ideas as being thought of as the data that should inform what the American Jewish community is about. But you're right, the effectiveness, there's something happens in this period of time. Lila Berman writes about it extensively, that sociology becomes the dominant industry of Jewish wisdom to shape Jewish communal decision-making. And we have to wrestle with the aftermath of that.
So I want to go to some of the questions, and then hopefully we'll be able to get in one more of the texts. Let's just look at the question of Jews of color. Claire, I'm going to give you the first shot at this, because I'm sure neither of you or any of us could have predicted, I think, the national reckoning that we have all lived through. And I think we would all agree an overdue schedule of waking up to what people are feeling and where injustices are pervasive, et cetera. I don't have to summarize what this summer has laid bare. But that is missing from the book. And can you talk about whether that was where you weighed, first of all, the issue of race at all, and then Jews of color in particular, which is obviously not just Black Americans, but all Jews of color.
Yeah, sure. So there are a number of different ways I want to approach this question. So I'm going to I'll give you several answers and hopefully they'll weave themselves together.
And the only thing I'm going to say is that we have 15 minutes.
We're short on time. Okay.
Yeah.
So I will be succinct. I do want to note that the reality that not all Jews are white of Ashkenazi background is recognized by some of our commentators in their essays, even though we don't have a primary source that's specifically about Jews and race. And there's an extent to which our canon reflects the same or continues the same blind spots that the canons that Yehuda and I were taught in graduate school and growing up, some of the same blind spots around that. And I acknowledge that, and it's a shortcoming of the book. And it rests on us that we kept pushing, this is something we were aware of and we kept talking about and never really settled on the material that we wanted to bring into the book. And then all of a sudden the book is 15% over our contracted amount, and we had handed it in and then it kept going. My great hope is that what we've seen this summer in terms of the amplifying of the voices of Jews of color in America, as well as the amplifying of Jews of Sephardic and Mizrahi, Middle Eastern background in Israel, starting I think even at an earlier point, that amplifying of voices will continue, and that canonical, as we're saying, pieces will emerge over the next 10 years, 15 years, so that whoever edits the new Jewish canon will include those voices without even thinking. We are working on a website that will be something of a companion to the book, where there will be a section with further reading. And even just in the last month, I've expanded my own knowledge of writings by Jews of color tremendously, and I'm going to be putting up some of the pieces that I like best on that website. But the last thing that I'll say is some of the pieces that I foresee becoming really important pieces that people will return to, Jews and non-Jews, when seeking to understand the experience of Jews of color in America. Many of those pieces actually were written since 2015. I'm thinking of Michael Twitty, whose book has been mentioned to me many, many times. It's from 2018. So just misses our cutoff. But there are pieces that are earlier that will be up on the website. One of them is by your Rabbi, Abby, about Kimchi on the Seder plate from 2013. And that's one you can Google it. It comes right to the top. So it's a great, catchy title and easy to find.
Yeah, it's a wonderful piece. So this is a question about the word authority. You have very astute listeners here. Both of the editors both of you have used the word authoritative to explain what texts were included, what texts not. How do you understand this term? I can think of at least 3 readings. 1, they are regarded by a significant subset of Jews to be authoritative. 2, they should be regarded by Jews as authoritative. 3, they are authoritative, i.e. possess actual scholarly authority on the matters on which they are writing. So which of these do the editors have in mind as they appeal to authoritativeness to explain why texts were included? I don't know who gave that, but you can imagine. It's probably a Hardman family member.
Yeah. Are we allowed just to say yes? I think we, at various points, we're exercising or we're judging pieces to have any one of the 3 types of authority. Some of the pieces are written by scholars who have authority in that sense to talk about whatever it is they're talking about. Others are pieces that, because they were so widely read and cited and so on and so forth, became authoritative. And others are ones that have had an effect on the communal priorities in the period that we're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really trying to cure, in as much as we're trying to, I feel conflicted about whether when you say they were inherently authoritative, you kind of take away editorial control. No, we were making choices. And so the primary thing here is that Claire and I were deciding to put these in the book. And I want to own that because we are in some places saying, yeah, everyone was reading and talking about this. You know, when Peter Beinart wrote The Failure of American Jewish Establishment in 2011, everybody read that, or at least in our world, everybody was reading it. I remember when Chaim Soloveitchik wrote Rupture and Reconstruction, and it was circulating in Orthodox yeshivas as a printout, a photocopy, because we didn't have the internet. Yeah, it's like, these are the things that people were reading. But I do see our control on it. And I think the control is exercised at making sure that whether or not these are all the pieces, a lot of the major conversations are represented. So for instance, like there's a big difference between Wiesel's Nobel Prize speech, which is heard by a lot of people around the world, and Nomi Seidman's academic essay, Disentangling Wiesel and His Legacy, which is not read by a lot of people, but it helps our readers understand that Wiesel is not an uncomplicated figure. And so what both of those together help us do is to put the conversations themselves or the ideas themselves at the forefront, where the writings, the primary sources, are the mechanism that enables us to have those conversations.
But you know what's striking me listening to you both is that this sounds very sane and very calm. And whenever I've especially been in Hartman learning, and it's not just with Yehuda alone, but you have so many incredible teachers and seminars that are both online and in person, there is a kind of civility to the discourse and the debate that I think is a hallmark, a touchstone, and very intentional about how you present these things. But I'm living in a Jewish world where it is not calm and it is not necessarily civil. And whether that's on social media or within a synagogue or within an institutional life, there's a lot of blacklisting and internal shaming of each other. You're either with us or against us. There isn't a lot of room to even think about reading or Peter Beinart in a synagogue and discussing it. That actually is a third rail for many synagogues. For better or for ill. I'm not saying where I come out on that. I'm saying that is in my travels where we are. So Yehuda, can you just address, I think that's part of what this book can do is kind of force us to have these like even allow the conversation to happen. But in many Jewish spaces, and I'm so tired of the word spaces that I committed not to use it and just did, if not now, breaking the silence, combatants for peace, we actually we can't utter the word, let alone bring it to the table for discussion.
Yeah. I want our readers, I understand why it seems civil. We're all civil with each other right now. We're talking about these issues dispassionately, even though both of us are very passionate about this project. There's a lot of hostility and anger and rage coursing through a lot of the contributors in this volume. And on 3 different occasions, we profiled debates. There was the Danny Gordis, Sharon Brous exchange of letters around the Gaza war in 2014, which was one of the grossest things to read when it was happening in real time, because I knew all of these players. It was just the worst version of this kind of conversation. There's a series of debates between Arthur Green and Danny Landis about new Jewish theologies. There's a record of the debate between Yitz Greenberg and Meir Kahana. So we put those in the book, and the subtitle is Ideas and Debates, precisely because the goal here is not to sanitize this period. It's actually to name what are the forces at work that are creating the kind of political, social divisions in Jewish life. What do we have to read and understand to see that? And I have a vested interest, personally and institutionally, in promoting Beit Midrash culture. I would like our Jewish community to be capable of debating with and through ideas without cultures of delegitimization, even among our hardest issues. But I don't think we do that I don't think we've sanitized those issues. I think we've actually tried to preserve, some of the rawness about that. And Claire alluded to breaking the silence, but on the far other extreme, and I don't want to put these things in the same sentence, we also put in an enormous amount of literature of hate that has come out in the Israeli ultra-nationalist scene. And it's going to I know that inclusion is really offensive to a lot of people, because that has literally produced violence against Palestinians and against non-compliant Jews who are not compliant with those politics. You have to listen for that in the book. And I want our readers to be agitated by it. And I want our readers to also and to notice the exoticism of that which they wouldn't have recognized from their own period of time, but that it's actually having an impact on Jewish communal conversation in spite of that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Claire.
If I could just jump in for one second. I think that the question of authority always has an implied additional term, which is authenticity, and whose views are authentically Jewish. We often will say, well, just to think about the ultra-nationalists advocating violence, who Yehuda just mentioned, there's, I think in some circles, a tendency to say, well, that's not authentically Jewish. That kind of political fundamentalism is beyond the pale. And part of what the book is saying is that whether you want to push the leftists or the liberals out of beyond the pale, or those on the right or the other extreme, they're all writing out of Jewish sources to Jewish questions about Jewish ideas. And the conversation is that wide because it encompasses so many different conversations. And my favorite, looking across the book, we have one of the texts that's in there, Shmirat Shabbat Kehilchata, is a book about the minutia of observing the Sabbath laws. And the person who wrote that would never in a million years have considered Judith Plaskow, a feminist theologian, to be part of the same Jewish conversation that he was in. I mean, what would they even have said to each other? And so that's what this book is trying to do, is in the mind of the reader and in the community of readers to say, well, it's all one conversation. What do we learn about that conversation when we expand it in this way with these sources?
That's great. And that's a perfect way to kind of segue into our home stretch here. And Yehuda, I'm going to give you the last word. Part of what struck me in this book is also there are people who change their minds, which I thought is very interesting and kind of un-Jewish sometimes. And to also just see how an intellectual argument can be changed by events, by a kind of self-awareness or new information, new facts on the ground. But I'm thinking of Rachel Adler. I'm also thinking of Benny Morris. In some ways, his facts didn't change, but his opinion did. But just if you could sort of help us with it, it's not just one orthodoxy or another, but also an evolution of thinking. Even the Siddur segment, where the prayer book has changed more than people realize. It has been customized more than people realize, personalized more than people realize. There is, I think, in that sense, the fact that we have that, I mean, that is the best of our tradition too, is that it endures, I think, because it adapts.
Yeah, I would say on that, we included Aaron Lichtenstein's speech in 1995, following the murder of Yitzhak Rabin Lichtenstein, a leader on the left of the religious Zionist community. So I have a personal attachment to this because I was in the room when that speech was given, and it was life-changing to hear it. And now, so this for me was like, let me get an essay written. It was a beautiful essay by David Wolkenfeld. I'm like, what did that speech actually mean about religious Zionism in that moment? And one of the things I would love for our learners to do and our readers is to figure out find one thing in the book that you read already, or maybe you were in the room when it happened, and listen for whether you changed in the 20 years since you read it the first time, or whether you understand it differently today. So it's not just some of our authors changed their political positions, it's that we're all evolving politically and morally, and we should listen for that too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sufrin, Dr. Kurtzer, Sam, wherever you are, who is behind the scenes, but as someone who's been behind the scenes, one of the most important kind of levers of the wheel here. Thank you, Sam, for all your help. And to all of you who are on this, I hope you will get the book. I hope you will look at the Hartman, the website, because there are all of these conversations now. They've put so much great material and discussion about the material available to all of us. And I think there's a survey that people want. I hate surveys, but I guess you're telling us to fill one out. That's going to be my opposition as we end this call. I hope you all stay safe. I hope you all keep reading and learning. And thank you all for asking me to do this.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you, Abby.